So let's start with death. I mean, death is when we most often consider inheritance tax and when we talk to clients about it. So without taking you back to your first ever lesson on inheritance tax, obviously when a person dies, their estate may become subject to inheritance tax depending on reliefs, exemptions, and so on. The nil rate band, which as I say is 325,000, can be reduced by gifts made within 7 years of the death of the testator. But conversely, and a more recent addition to the nil rate band, is the ability to increase the nil rate band. And there are two ways in which this can happen. Firstly, you can now inherit a nil rate band from a deceased spouse or civil partner, and that can be up to 100% of the available nil rate band. So if there's a husband and wife and the husband dies and leaves everything to his wife, then in certain circumstances, the wife can actually have a £650,000 nil rate band, her 325 and her former husband's 325. And here is the problem. As I said, there wasn't enough cash to pay the inheritance tax liability, which means that the only asset remaining was the property, which could be sold in order to fund the inheritance tax. Raising equity against the property wasn't really a viable option because there was nothing in the estate with which to pay the interest that would have been generated on any loan. So ultimately, Mrs. Raboni's residuary beneficiaries settled the inheritance tax liability from their own resources. So they said that we will eventually get this house and we will settle the tax. 13 years later, Mr. Bozier died while he was still living at the property, which, just as an aside, shows how generous the residuary beneficiaries were, that they paid this inheritance tax liability and 13 years later still actually hadn't got any of their inheritance. As I mentioned right at the beginning of this talk when talking about inheritance tax, it won't surprise you to know that the house had increased in value, and in fact it had almost tripled in value up to 827,000. HMRC, on Mr. Bozier's death, said that it was an interest in possession for Mr. Bozier, and therefore the house was part of his estate for inheritance tax. And initially, Mr. Bozier's estate's advisors agreed and paid the tax liability of just under £200,000. However, subsequently, the executor's advisors thought better of this and said, no, it's not an interest in possession, and challenged HMRC. And there was recently the first tier tribunal's decision. And what they decided was that Mr. Bozier didn't have an interest in possession.